Josh was sitting in a classroom, not listening to his teacher drone through algebra. His concentration was on the notably more interesting subject of Danny Evans. Her shaggy blonde pixie cut still had a hint of color where she'd dyed it blue to support the soccer team. There was a fake ring through the corner of her nose. She said she was trying it out before she made a decision, and her loose top had slid off the shoulder of the arm she was leaning on. A tattoo was just visible on the inside of her bicep. Some kind of lettering. Josh wished she'd move so he could read it. He wondered if her father had thrown a fit over that.
Josh? Josh!
He jolted straighter in his chair.
Huh?
His eyes twitched over to her seat. She was looking at him. Wow, those eyes were green. The teacher frowned.
Pay attention, Josh.
His gaze flickered to her again. A flash of white teeth and dimples, and she had turned as the teacher began again. She had one of those smiles where your nose scrunches and your eyes crinkle up until they almost disappear. He was pretty sure she could hear his heart thudding from there. The congratulations after the game and now a smile. He was going to have to man up and talk to her soon. He wasn't thinking of Danny now.
3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes!
The man screamed into his face over the roar of drive engines, holding up 2 fingers and a thumb. Josh jerked his head in a nod, and the man moved toward the next seat, yelling at Steve. Josh dug around his pockets, but he had already used the nausea pills. He still felt sick from the jump. Huddling deeper into his seat, he yanked the already tight harness tighter.
2 minutes! 2 minutes!
The oxygen mask went on. High oxy planet, but this high up, you'd be unconscious in 2 minutes and dead in 20. Josh loosened his helmet to scratch his head, then jerked the Kevlar back low over his eyes.
1 minute!
Enormous blast doors slid open along the sides of the carrier. He was glad they hadn't opened sooner. The abrupt perspective shift from traveling toward a planet to straight down at its surface always made him ill. Josh looked up across the fuselage. The mask hid the teeth, but Steve's eyes showed his smirk. He was flashing 2 fingers and a thumb, then 2 fingers for several flashes, then 1, less than 10 seconds. Josh buried himself as far as possible into his seat, tensing his abdomen and shoulders, sending his breath hissing through his clenched teeth. It was easier to come back up if your blood pressure was high. The drive engine stopped, reversed, slowing the carrier to almost half its original speed in 3 seconds. Then, the electromagnetic rails fired, launching Josh's craft from the carrier at over 150 kilometers an hour. After this many times, Josh didn't try to fight it anymore. He passed out. He'd be awake again in 10 seconds when his blood pressure stabilized. Josh dragged himself out of the darkness to the roar of his craft in freefall. Steve's eyes were just starting to flicker. The new guy, some rookie fresh off Terra, hadn't had his harness tight enough. Looked like a broken arm. He'd be awake in a few and screaming. Whatever. A lot of new guys broke their necks. A quick glance up the fuselage told him the pilots were already wrestling the ship under control. With agonizing slowness, they began to level out. Against the massive G-forces, Josh craned his head to get a look out the plexiglass. Drag fins and flaps struggled to find purchase in the thin air. The ship lurched sickeningly as an engine coughed into life, then 3 more. The exhaust, mixing with the atmosphere, streaked vapor trails across the sky. Finally, the craft was level, cruising at its best operational altitude. 9,000 meters. That's 5.5 miles. Straight up. So high not even the Xenos can see you with the naked eye. So high that the temperature is 40 degrees below zero. Take off a glove and you'll lose your fingers. The crew was awake now. Steve was kicking his harness off and pulling a belt of ammo from under his seat, muttering to himself as he ran through his weapons check. There was a smear of blood leaking from under the rim of his helmet. He'd been trying to get one the correct size for months. One of the other gunners, Josh didn't know his name, was trying to splint the rookie's arm. Josh opened a cabinet and retrieved paper and pencils, already sorting through the calculations. The battle for Terra had left no doubt that humans were vastly outnumbered and out-teched. Although they had driven the Xenos, or Shrike as they called themselves, from Earth, it had been indisputably a Pyrrhic victory. Humanity knew a second invasion would have no ground assault, but orbital bombardment to transform the surface into a sea of glass. The only option was attack. Scavenging among the wreckage of the planet, humans began to uncover Shrike tech in the burned-out hulls of their ships, most of it dead or damaged, but some of it partially functional. It took 3 months before the first breakthrough came. A team reverse-engineered the OS and learned to talk to the computer. Well, learned to talk to a water pump. It took another month before some 17-year-old kid figured out how stellar coordinates worked in the Shrike's navigation computers. People didn't even try to understand their propulsion systems, just rebuilt them exactly and turned them on. It was actually the fact that humans didn't know how they worked which led to the single greatest technological advantage of the war. Humans had no knowledge of relay stations or FTL lanes and simply assumed that a wormhole could be opened from anywhere. This led to the development of the wormhole generator, which was initially called the teleporter, and finally became the jump drive, which is why Josh was 5.5 miles above the surface of a Shrike homeworld, trying to perform long division in his head, while Steve kicked the side of the aircraft and yelled at his gun about a
piece of garbage mechanic who doesn't know which end of you to point at the Shrike.
Soapbox was trying to calm him down. This mission was not against the Shrike military. If all went well, they wouldn't see the enemy at all. This mission sought to fight the greater menace, the power behind the enemy's war machine, the industrial heart of their homeworld, factories and munitions plants, manufacturing depots and steel mills, shipyards and refineries, pinpoints on a map that meant armor, plasma cannons, rubber, ball bearings, fuel cells, engines, ships, targets to be destroyed. And these are the destroyers. 260 quad-engine bombers, jumped into Atmo at 4 different jump points and released from their carriers under the cover of 2 Terran dreadnoughts, each with a crew of 9 men and a belly full of bombs. And here is the plan, timed to the minute. At 0 hour, the 2 Terran warships jump within 1,000 kilometers of the Shrike orbital defensive fleet, their jump-slung mass drivers crippling 2 capital ships, and immediately jump again. One midway between the planet and its first moon, and the other 60 degrees around the planet in far orbit. At +3 minutes, the carriers take advantage of the confusion and jump into the atmosphere to release the bombers. At +7 minutes, formations are established and headings are calculated. At +19, the Blue Force, with 60 aircrafts, will enter Shrike sensor range, en route to bomb a dry dock, destroying several cruisers in for repair. Also at this time, 1 Terran warship will jump away from the system, needed to again patrol the relay stations and jump points near Terra against multiple enemy fleets. At +21, the Green Force of 40 bombers enters sensor range and swings in a wide circle, threatening 2 factories and an infantry barracks, but eventually destroying a steel mill. At +23, the White Force with 80 bombers and an escort of 40 fighters enters sensor range to dive within 4 kilometers of the surface, heading for a major city and drawing the attention of 15 fighter squadrons and a pair of heavy frigates. But the White Force carries no bombs at all. It is a distraction for the Red Force, the main purpose for this mission. The Red Force has orders to destroy drive yard facilities, where intelligence believes a battleship is nearing completion. Josh was the navigator and lead bombardier of the Red Force, made up of the 5th Bomber Group of the 2nd Wing of the Terran Offensive Fleet. He would be 21 later today, though he didn't remember. Another glance out the plexiglass showed the rest of his bomber group pulling closer. It took a pilot's full concentration to keep a 32-ton aircraft in tight formation, but the formation was their best defense against fighters. The ships were deployed in a staggered combat box, stacked side by side and up and down. The formation was designed to uncover all angles for gunners, to overcome the danger of firing into friendly ships, allowing concentrated cones of fire to cover the sky for 1,000 meters in every direction. Steve let out a whoop and made a rude gesture at the surface below him. Seems he got his gun working.
Hey, look up.
Steve tossed a pair of binocs at him. Josh pushed up against the fuselage and angled the binocs upward through the gunner's window. This high, the thin atmo allowed vision to pass virtually unobstructed. He panned slowly until he saw the flashes. The Terran warship playing tag with the better half of a Shrike fleet, far enough away that only the energy bursts from hostile ships could be seen. Josh handed back the binocs and ran through the math in his head again.
Think they'll make it?
Steve asked quietly. Josh was silent for a moment.
They've had to jump twice before the mission even started.
Steve stared grimly upward, the binocs hanging loosely in his hand.
Don't miss.
Josh bent his head once more over his paper. The bomber group had passed the invisible line of enemy sensor range. On the surface, anti-aircraft batteries awoke as their software detected the faint thermal signatures from the engines. The computers threw up targeting solutions, and defensive batteries opened fire. Flak looks harmless. Soft puffs of smoke that drift lazily above the clouds. Except each puff is a shell burst. If you're within 25 meters, you'll fly home full of steel splinters. The first few missions had been met with missiles, close to 100% casualties. So the Terrans adapted. The bombers had scrapped xenopropulsion systems and were now driven by 4 1,400-horsepower radial piston engines. Props. These heavies had a top speed of just over 330 kilometers an hour. Existing missile tech was problematic against engines so slow and cool. The drawback was how long it now took to reach the target. 5 minutes feels like a lifetime when the only thing between you and the flak is a few centimeters of steel. Also, enemy fighters can reach Mach 2 in atmo. Josh felt the familiar claustrophobic feeling twisting at his insides. On the surface, you can run, or you can hide, in a steel box in the sky, with no shields, no flares, no cover. You can't. In a bomber, you can wait, and pray, and hope that wherever the next shell hits, you're not there.
Change heading. Josh, still on it?
Came over the intercom. Josh touched the mic at his throat, fighting against the fear crushing his lungs.
Yeah, still got you.
Jones was one of the pilots. He'd been flying these Marauder-class heavy bombers for 6 months, 4 of those during combat missions. He began changing course every 10 seconds to confuse the anti-aircraft batteries. Now Josh had to introduce geometry into his equations. Outside, the rest of the formation adjusted to the leader. The most advanced piece of equipment in the entire aircraft was the electric start for each motor. The Terrans had quickly realized that wireless electronic signatures pointed like fingers directly to the bombers. So Josh scribbled with his pencil, calculating airspeed and altitude, wind speed and angular approach. As lead bombardier, his aim had to be good. Every aircraft in the group would drop their bombs when he dropped his. Another shell detonated. Josh instinctively ducked. That one had been close.
There goes X-Girl.
Soapbox muttered.
Right through the engine.
Josh didn't look. He'd seen enough bombers spinning toward the surface, and through the engine meant fire.
Final course. Pilot to bombardier. She's all yours.
Josh started a countdown on his watch, making a final run-through of his scribbles.
20 seconds.
Committed to their bombing run, the formation could no longer dodge the flak batteries. The Shrike now knew their speed, direction, and target, and they walled the approach with steel so thick you could get out and walk on it. The satellites were angled now, too, helping to triangulate the bombers' positions. Another shell tore through the wing of the ship behind his, sending his own bomber lurching up and forward on the shockwave. Josh didn't take his eyes off his watch as the damaged bomber lost control and dove through the formation in a half-roll, slamming through another ship, shearing off a wing and igniting the fuel lines. The bomb bay doors crawled open, driven by hydraulic motors. Josh tried to shut his ears to the tearing sound of the wind stream. From orbit, the planet was pretty. Lots of purple. But now, through the bomb bay, there was only the roiling smoke screen as the Shrike attempted to hide their infrastructure. Rookie was curled under his seat, urgently explaining to no one that he had to get home for his mother's birthday. Josh swallowed hard. He didn't notice when a shell fragment tore through the side of the aircraft and buried itself in Soapbox's lower jaw. He went down slowly, like falling through jelly.
Bombs away.